The sandstone Colossus stands 14 feet tall in room 3 of the Cairo Museum, and something about it stops people in the middle of a crowded gallery. Not the scale. Colossal statues are standard in Egyptian collections. What stops people is the face. The jaw extends too far. The skull elongates in a way no other pharaoh's portrait shares. The eyes sit back under brows that slope at an angle absent from every other carved royal face across 3,000 years of Egyptian art. The figure crosses its arms over its chest, holds the crook and flail, wears the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. The pose is standard, the face is not. The statue depicts Akhenaten, the 18th dynasty pharaoh who ruled from approximately 1353 to 1336 BCE. It was quarried at Karnak before he abandoned Thebes entirely and built a new capital from bare desert, at the site now known as Amarna. The physical features on this statue appear on every representation of Akhenaten produced across his 17-year reign without variation. His daughters appear with the same elongated skulls in the Amarna family reliefs, limestone panels on which the royal family gathers under the sun disk in scenes of unusual domestic closeness. Nefertiti's portrait bust in Berlin carries the same extended cranium, the same long neck. These features were not the work of one sculptor in one year who made a strange choice. Hundreds of craftsmen in different cities working across 2 decades produced the same specific features on the same figure. The standard explanation treats this as artistic convention. Akhenaten instituted a radical religious reform centered on the Aten, the sun disk, and the unusual style of Amarna art is understood as a theological statement, a way of depicting the pharaoh as something beyond ordinary human form. Egyptian art had always favored idealized representation over realistic portraiture. Style and royal ideology moved together throughout the dynastic period. That argument has genuine force. It does not account for the consistency. If you're enjoying this story so far, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Artistic conventions in Egyptian history shifted between reigns and within them, between workshops and across decades. The treatment of the human body evolved throughout the dynastic period. No previous pharaoh's religious program produced a completely stable set of physical features across every medium, every scale, and every workshop for 17 straight years. The elongated skull appears in faience pendants found in private homes and in the granite colossi that once lined the Karnak processional. The extended jaw is present in intimate family scenes painted on plaster palace walls and in formal state reliefs carved on temple pylons. The unusual distribution of body weight appears in official state portraits and in small amulets of a type ordinary Egyptians kept in domestic settings. Whatever hundreds of different craftsmen across the empire were depicting, they were depicting the same thing every time. That kind of stability across that volume does not come from a convention, it comes from a model. The scope of the artistic record matters here. The Egyptian Exploration Society's survey of the Amarna site documented evidence of at least 3 separate sculptors' workshops operating in the city simultaneously, all producing work with the same physical features applied to the same figures. The palace at Amarna contained painted floor panels showing the royal family in private moments, works not intended for any public gaze, carrying the same anatomical features as the formal state monuments. The consistency runs across 17 years of production, across media from limestone relief to painted plaster to fired faience to carved granite, across works made for the eyes of gods and works found in the rubble of ordinary homes. No other artistic tradition in ancient Egypt produced this degree of anatomical specificity sustained across an entire reign. Other stylistic shifts, the elongated faces of the Amarna period excepted, tended to vary between workshops, soften across years, or remain limited to formal monumental work. This one did not vary. That absence of variation is itself a kind of evidence. The hieroglyphic texts that survive from Akhenaten's reign describe his nature in terms that go further than the standard rhetoric of Egyptian royal inscription. The great hymn to the Aten, inscribed on the tomb walls of the royal official at Amarna, and translated into English by Egyptologist James Henry Breasted in the early 20th century, describes Akhenaten as the single being who knows the full intelligence of the disk, the one point at which the sun's will and human existence make contact. Language of unique mediation between divine and human runs through the text, But elevated mediation language is present throughout Egyptian royal inscriptions going back to the Old Kingdom. What makes the Amarna text distinctive is what they add to that vocabulary, a tendency to describe the pharaoh as different in nature from other beings, not merely higher than them. That language has older roots. The pyramid texts of Unas at Saqqara, the oldest religious inscriptions ever found inside a pyramid, use the phrase, "born of two mothers," across multiple utterances to describe the nature of the enlightened king. One mother is human, the other is characterized using vocabulary associated with the sky, with light, with the primordial force of creation, rather than with any human or divine figure in a familiar sense. The formula is not a simple divine birth claim of the kind that runs through standard royal inscription. The standard claim describes the pharaoh as son of Ra, chosen and protected by the gods. The pyramid text formula describes something that entered the world through two channels of a fundamentally different kind. Scholars of Egyptian royal theology have noted that the dual birth formulation carries a different register from the elevation language, implying a pharaoh whose origin is categorically distinct from other humans rather than simply superior to them. The distinction matters. Egyptian scribes were precise about category. The same textual record that uses one type of determinative marker for gods, another for historical kings, and another for mythological beings, does not blend those categories carelessly. When the pyramid texts place the pharaoh's origin partly outside the human channel, the scribes are not reaching for a metaphor. They are making a classification. At Deir el-Bahari, the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut preserves a sequence of wall panels depicting the divine conception of the royal heir. The god Amun visits the queen in the form of her husband. The child conceived in that union is described with a phrase that carries biological rather than purely spiritual weight, rendered across multiple translations as something close to made of different substance or formed of different matter. The Deir el-Bahari sequence has been examined by Egyptologists working on divine birth ideology for over a century. The standard scholarly reading treats the language as theological metaphor, the Egyptian way of expressing divine sanction for royal authority. The Amarna evidence places pressure on that reading without overturning it, because it places alongside the conception texts a pharaoh depicted across every known portrait with physical features that no single known medical condition has explained. The medical record on Akhenaten's physical depictions is genuine and unresolved. Marfan syndrome was proposed in the 1990s to account for the elongated limbs and extended facial structure. Marfan produces skeletal elongation but does not cause the specific cranial shape visible in the Amarna portraits. Froelich syndrome, a rare pituitary disorder, accounts for the feminine fat distribution, but Froelich patients are characteristically infertile, and Akhenaten fathered at least 6 daughters by Nefertiti and likely additional children by secondary wives. Craniosynostosis, a condition causing premature fusion of skull plates and unusual cranial growth, was proposed in a 2009 paper and addresses the skull shape without explaining the rest of the body as depicted across 17 years of portraiture. No single known genetic condition produces the specific combination of features shown consistently across hundreds of individual works. The medical literature on this question has been active since the 1960s. It has not converged on an answer. What sits at the end of this line of examination is a specific cluster of evidence. A royal figure whose physical depictions are medically anomalous and historically unprecedented in their consistency. Hieroglyphic texts from his own period and from sources predating him by 1,000 years that describe the pharaoh's nature using language suggesting biological distinction rather than divine elevation alone. A family in which multiple members are shown with the same distinctive cranial features across the same period of production, and an erasure of the Amarna period that, when examined closely, proves more systematic and more specifically targeted than standard political practice required. In 2010, it became briefly possible to imagine that genetics might answer the question the portraits had been asking for a century. A team announced the most extensive DNA analysis ever conducted on ancient Egyptian royalty. The study was led by Zahi Hawass, then Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, and published in the Journal of the American Medical Association under the title Ancestry and Pathology in King Tutankhamun's Family. The team analyzed DNA from 11 mummies recovered from the Valley of the Kings, including Tutankhamun, the 2 fetuses found in his tomb, and several unidentified mummies from the Amarna period, thought to be members of the royal family. The study's published findings were extensive. Tutankhamun's remains showed evidence of multiple overlapping pathological conditions, including avascular bone necrosis, evidence of choler disease affecting the foot, and what the team identified as traces consistent with repeated malaria infection. The team proposed a family tree based on the genetic comparisons. It identified the two fetuses as Tutankhamun's daughters. It identified a mummy recovered from a side chamber in another valley of the king's tomb as Tutankhamun's likely mother, and it identified the KV-55 mummy, found in 1907, in a damaged coffin whose original occupant had been deliberately obscured, as Tutankhamun's probable father, making that figure the most credible candidate for Akhenaten himself. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What the study did not include was the underlying sequence data. The published paper presented the team's interpretations of the genetic analysis. The raw sequence data, the kind that allows independent researchers to verify conclusions, run alternative analyses, or identify patterns the original team did not examine, was not deposited in public genetic databases at the time of publication. In ancient DNA research, where contamination is a persistent methodological concern and the stakes of misidentification are substantial, the normal expectation is that raw data be made available alongside published findings so the research community can evaluate what was actually recovered. Specialists in ancient DNA noted this absence publicly when the study was released. They did not allege fabrication. They pointed out that the study's conclusions could not be independently evaluated without the underlying data. That data has not been made fully public in the years since publication. In 2020, researchers who re-examined the published findings using the data that had been made available concluded that several of the family relationships the study proposed could not be confirmed from the evidence the broader research community could access. They identified concerns with the proposed identification of the KV-55 mummy as Tutankhamun's father, noting that the skeletal evidence on which the age estimate relied produced inconsistent conclusions across multiple independent examinations. The re-examination did not prove the 2010 study wrong. It demonstrated that the study's central claims could not be independently verified with what had been released. The KV-55 mummy sits at the center of this problem. It was found in 1907 in the Valley of the Kings by excavator Edward Ayrton, working on behalf of American collector Theodore Davis. The coffin containing it had originally been made for a royal woman and subsequently modified to receive a different occupant. The cartouches that would have identified that occupant had been cut deliberately from the coffin's surface. The inlaid face of the coffin had been removed and destroyed. Whoever was interred in this tomb had been erased before or shortly after burial in the same manner and by the same hands responsible for chiseling Akhenaten's name from temple walls across Egypt. The skeletal record of the KV-55 mummy has produced conflicting conclusions across more than a century of examination. Studies based on bone plate fusion and dental wear have generated age-at-death estimates ranging from the mid-20s to the early 40s. Akhenaten is known to have ruled for at least 17 years, making a death age in the mid-20s difficult to reconcile with the established chronology of his reign. The 2010 study placed the age at death between 35 and 45. Consistent with a long-reigning pharaoh. Earlier and later analyses dispute this. The dispute has not been resolved in the published literature. The mummy most often proposed as Akhenaten's cannot be confirmed as his, which means the most direct physical evidence for what the Amarna portraits depict has never been securely identified and examined. The erasure that followed Akhenaten's death was unlike anything the Egyptian record contains before or since. His successor Horemheb dismantled the capital at Amarna block by block, reusing the stones as fill material inside temple pylons at Hermopolis and Karnak. Reliefs from Amarna were excavated in the 20th century from inside the walls of those later structures, the stones buried face inward, the images hidden inside the construction rather than destroyed outright. Akhenaten's cartouches were chiseled from temple walls across Egypt. His name and those of the pharaohs who immediately followed him were removed from official king lists. The Turin King List, the most thorough Egyptian royal record that survives, contains a gap at the precise point where the Amarna rulers would appear, a section attributed by historians to physical damage to the papyrus that nevertheless falls exactly where a deliberate erasure would fall. The campaign exceeded what political removal typically required. Pharaohs who lost favor were dropped from records and had their monuments reassigned to later rulers. The erasure of the Amarna period was more total, faster, and more methodically targeted than that pattern. It went beyond the religious content of the Aten period, beyond the hymns and temple iconography and images of the sun disk. Among the Amarna inscriptions documented by excavators in the decades before, portions of the site were systematically removed. Several carried language describing the pharaoh's physical being in terms that deviated from standard royal inscription, texts describing the pharaoh as constituted differently from other beings rather than simply elevated above them. Those were among the first and most thoroughly eliminated. The priesthood of Amun could tolerate an erased heretic. What they went further to erase was a specific claim about what the heretic was. Modern attempts to investigate these questions with contemporary scientific tools have met consistent resistance. Research teams applying to conduct advanced genetic analysis on Amarna period royal mummies using methods more sensitive and less destructive than those available to the 2010 team have had applications declined or delayed without published explanation. Proposals for detailed physical anthropological surveys of the mummies that survive from the Amarna royal family, including cranial measurements that could establish whether any of the individuals show actual skeletal morphology corresponding to what the portraits depict, have not been approved. The question of whether the physical features in the Amarna art represent a genuine characteristic of the royal family is one that careful measurement of existing museum-held specimens could potentially answer. That measurement has not been taken. Before we go further, this is a channel about the questions the ancient world hasn't fully answered. Some of what we'll look at is solid and documented. Some of it is theory, and where it is, I'll say so. The point isn't to hand you a verdict. It's to show you what's actually down here and let you decide what you think it means. What the assembled evidence presents is a configuration that deserves to sit with you. A pharaoh whose physical depictions are medically anomalous and historically unprecedented in their consistency across 17 years and hundreds of works. Hieroglyphic texts from his own period and from sources predating him by 1,000 years that describe the pharaoh's nature and language, moving beyond elevation into categorical distinction. A DNA study that proposed a revolutionary identification but withheld the sequence data that would allow the scientific community to evaluate whether that identification is accurate. A proposed candidate for his mummy whose age at death remains disputed in the published literature. An erasure campaign that went further than political practice required and targeted specifically the inscriptions dealing with his nature and origin, and a consistent pattern of delays applied to the physical investigations most likely to produce a clear answer. None of this establishes the claim the title names. The texts describing the pharaoh's differentiated nature may operate entirely as theological metaphor in the tradition Egyptian royal inscription always employed. The physical depictions may represent a real genetic condition that medicine has simply not yet correctly characterized. The KV-55 mummy may not be Akhenaten at all. The raw genetic data, if it were released, might simply confirm the 2010 study's published family tree without producing any anomaly. These are all genuine possibilities. What they share is that none of them can be evaluated with what the research community currently has access to. The sequence data is not public. The skeletal survey has not been completed. The mummy is unconfirmed. The question that sits at the intersection of the artistic record, the textual record, and the genetic record has never been approached with all three lines of evidence simultaneously available for independent examination. The colossal statues are still in Room 3 of the Cairo Museum. The elongated skull is still on every one of them, 17 years and hundreds of individual works consistent to a degree that exceeds any documented artistic convention anywhere else in the Egyptian record. The pyramid texts still carry the dual birth formula. The Tomb of I still holds the great hymn. The KV-55 mummy is still in its case, still debated in the literature, its identification still proposed but not confirmed. The raw sequence data from the 2010 study is still not in the public domain. The cranial measurements that could confirm or deny whether any surviving Amarna period mummy shows actual skeletal elongation have not been published. And the question of what the craftsmen of the Amarna period were looking at when they produced, across 17 years and every medium and every scale, the same face with the same extended skull and the same long jaw, remains exactly as open as it was the first morning someone stood in that gallery and stopped. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.